I just got done beating onlyhuman, who was rated 722, and he's a lot harder than his rating would suggest. I'm rated 1141, and this is what chess is all about, folks. When you're in those tense, tight situations where every move counts. This was a long game, 70 moves. We actually had people who were watching us play, and we may not have been Gary Kasparov versus Bobby Fischer or Spassky, but we are intermediate players, and even though we're not as great or good as those guys, that don't mean that we can't put on a very exciting, entertaining show for people. And that's exactly what we did. This was a very classic match between two intermediate chess players. So let me get to it now because I don't have much time. He moved his pawn to e4. I threatened his pawn on e4 with my knight to f6. He moved his pawn to d3, protecting his pawn on e4. I moved my pawn up on d5, threatening his pawn. He moves his pawn to e5, threatening my knight. I then move my knight down to d7, threatening his pawn. He moves his pawn to d4. I move my pawn up to c5, threatening his pawn on d4. He protects his pawn on d4, moving his pawn down to c3. I take his pawn on d4, and he takes my pawn, so now we're exchanging the pawns early in the game, 1-1. I move my pawn to g6. He moves his knight down to f3. I move my queen to a5, putting him into check. He protects his king with his bishop to d2. I move my queen back down to b6. He moves his bishop down to c3. I move my pawn up to e6 so that his pawn can come no further into my territory. He moves his knight down to g5. He's taking full control of the center 4 squares and the center of the board here. So I need to do something quick. So I threaten his knight by moving my bishop to e7. He protects the knight with a pawn to h4. I threaten his bishop with my bishop to b4. He takes my bishop and I take his bishop, putting him into check. Queen to b4. He protects his king with his queen to d2. I then move my knight up to c6. I want to get my knight involved. He moves his knight to c3. I threaten his queen, moving my queen to d4. He decided that he wanted to exchange queens, and this is where it gets real exciting. I take his queen with my knight to d4. He then moved his bishop down, pinning my knight down. My knight can't move now because if he do, I'll be exposing myself and I can't move into check. So what I do is I now put him into check and threaten his rook. He has no other choice but to move his king out the way. That was the mistake that he made. And I take his rook. He takes my knight. I threaten his bishop, moving my pawn to a6. He takes my knight. We exchange bishops. He moves his pawn down to f4. I move my pawn up to f5. He moves his pawn down to b3. I move my rook over to c8, threatening his knight on c3. He protects his knight on c3 by moving his rook over to c1. I put him into check with my bishop to b5. He moves his king out the way. I threaten his knight with my pawn to h6. He has no other choice but to move, and he decides to take my pawn. I then threaten his knight, moving my king up to e7. He moves his knight out the way and threatens my bishop there. I move my pawn up to g5. He can't take that bishop because if he take that bishop, then I'll kill him with my pawn. Now I threaten his pawn. He decided to take it. I decide to take that. And now we exchange pawns. And I think we're tied now, 4 pawns apiece. But he's still up, I'm up material actually because I have 2 rooks. He has 1 rook and 2 knights. I have 2 rooks and a bishop and 4 pawns. He has 5 pawns. So we're kind of still even in the game. I move my rook up to h5. He moves his pawn down to g4, threatening my rook. I move my rook up to h3, putting him into check. He moves his king down to f4. Then I take his knight. He cannot take my rook. That was another mistake he made. He cannot take my rook, because if he take my rook, then I'm going to take his rook out. Well, he decided to do that. And I took his rook out, but this is why he did that. Because he was going to move his pawns down in hopes of getting a queen. He puts me into check. So I just moved down, thinking that he can't do nothing because I got my king right there. And then, you know, worst case scenario, I can bring my rook down. But then he puts me into check. And when he moved that other pawn down, that's when I started to get a little nervous. I didn't know what to do. So I threatened his pawn there by moving my rook over to e2. He gets his king involved. Then he moves his king down, and this is where I thought it was over. So I had to think very hard. So what I thought the best decision would be to do is to put his king into check. He takes the bishop. I decided to sacrifice the bishop. And I put him into check with the rook. He moves up to f7. I move my rook over to g6. I don't care about nothing at this point. I want that rook right there on g7. As long as I can get that rook, I'm okay, because I don't want that to become a queen, because it'll be over. This was a very tight situation, and every move from here on out, we had to really think. And I had to really think about the moves that I make, because any move can end the game for me. Because my back is against the wall, because his pawn is on my side of the board. So what he does is he threatens my rook, and I take the first pawn, because I don't want to give him any chance of getting any more pawns on this side of the board. He protects his pawn. I move my pawn up, because now I'm giving him a decision to make. He's either going to take that pawn right there, or I'm going to take his pawn. And he's going to take me. And then that'll give me more of a chance to move my pawn there up the board. He decides to move his knight down to e7. I move my pawn up again, getting closer to being promoted to a queen. He moves his pawn down and get a queen, and I just take him out automatically, because there was nothing else I could have done. It would have been checkmate. So he takes my rook, and that's a sacrifice that I had to make. Now he's up material. I move my pawn up to d2. I'm about to get a queen. And I move my king out the way. I probably should have just... Well, actually, I think I had to do it because I was into check. He put me into check. Put me into check again. He's trying to slowly move up the board to catch that pawn. And now I can't get a queen. So I had to get my king involved. And he stops me now from getting a queen. So what he does is he get his king involved as well, putting me into check constantly. There's nothing I can do because he has that square right there on... Okay, the square right there on d1. He's occupying it. So I had to get my other pawns involved. To slowly move my pawn. So now he's threatening my pawn right there, so I had to move it up so it can get protection. He moves over to b5, threatening my other pawn there, and I realized that I probably was going to more than likely lose that pawn, but he didn't take it. He put me back into check, so I decided to take his pawn. So he's definitely not going to get a queen now. He takes my pawn, so now we're in a back and forth battle, and he's trying to take my pawn and stop me from getting a queen. So I move up, threatening his knight. He moves down to e3, threatening my king. I move my king down to c3. He moves his knight back up to d1, and I move my queen back up to c2, threatening his knight while protecting my pawn there so his king can't take it. He puts me into check again, and I had to make a different move because it would have went to a draw if we would have made the same move 3 times. So he puts me into check again. I move over this time. He offered a draw, but I declined it, because I realized he could not take that pawn right there. So what I do now is move my pawn up to b2. Now it's pretty much over after this, because there's nothing else he can do. I move my pawn up and I get a queen. And this is where it ended. He moved his knight down to a3. I put him into check. He had no other choice but to move his king down. I take his rook out. He moves over to b5. I move my pawn up and becomes a queen. And this is how it ended. It was a great game. Very classic game between two intermediate players. And that's all she wrote. I was a stronger man and I won in the end. Thanks for watching.